welcome to the Acoustic Guitar Podcast. I'm your host, Nick Grizzle, joined for this episode by co-host Jeffrey Pepper Rodgers. And today, we've got Beatlemania, with a lively roundtable discussion chock full of inspiring musical examples all about arranging and performing the music of the Beatles on acoustic guitar. Like so many musicians of a certain generation, our guests started playing guitar in large part because of the Beatles. Laurence Juber has been playing Beatles tunes for 60 years and seriously arranging them for fingerstyle guitar since the mid-1990s, after playing alongside Paul McCartney as a member of Wings. Guitarist, composer, and professor of jazz studies Mimi Fox taught herself to play guitar at 10 years old when her cousin gifted her a copy of Rubber Soul. Though perhaps best known for his klezmer, folk, and jazz playing, Tim Sparks was also galvanized by the Beatles in his youth. Each of our guests take a different approach to arranging, adapting, reharmonizing, and reimagining these tunes. After you've listened to their conversation, I encourage you to check out the links in our show notes to learn more about them and hear even more of their music. You'll also find the link to support the Acoustic Guitar Podcast on Patreon. That's patreon.com/acousticguitarplus. Thanks for listening and chipping in if you can. Now I'll kick things over to Mimi Fox, who tells us about the first Beatles song she learned.
You know, it's still in my brain. I could play it two ways. It would be I've Just Seen a Face, which is the first song from the Rubber Soul album. It's still in my brain. I've just seen a face, I can't forget the time or place where we just met. Still in my brain. Exactly 50 plus years later, still in my brain. But I learned every song from that album. I remember when I worked out my own arrangement of the intro to Michelle, so I came up with and I was so excited when I was 10 and I had worked that out. You know, that just seemed, I remember I brought my guitar to school and I played that, but actually, a song that I recorded on my most recent album is, you know, Laurence was talking about John's songwriting because I was so enamored with Paul and I had arranged so many of his pieces for solo guitar. But anyway, recently I recorded In My Life. And, you know, again, it's just so... you know, etc. So yeah, and so to me that that's another song from the album that now I really appreciate. But anyway, yeah, for sure, I've Just Seen a Face. It will always be in my brain. And that was the second song I learned. The first one will make Laurence and Tim and hopefully all of you laugh was by another band, a lesser known from the British invasion, the Animals. Who I was also very fond of when I was 10. So anyway, that concludes this portion. Tim, what about you? What was your first one?
Well, me, I don't know. I enjoyed hearing all the Beatles tunes from the early 60s, but then, you know, I was also listening to Hendrix. And I guess the album that when I was really coming of age that impressed me the most was Sgt. Pepper's, that album. And in the White Album, I learned Rocky Raccoon. That was one I learned to play. It's more like years later I came back to the Beatles, and but when I think about this whole Beatles thing now is, you know, there's a famous saying by Dante, the Italian Renaissance or Italian medieval poet, who said that what we call it modern is what we haven't decided whether or not we want to keep it collectively as a civilization. And I think what's happened now is after those 60 years, the Beatles material stands up, and it's kind of being appreciated in a different light because actually, in the period right after the Beatles in the 70s, 80s, people heard so much Beatles, they're just kind of tired of it, I mean, and when you heard Beatles bands, they were just trying to dress up like the Beatles and sound exactly like them. But now there's a very interesting universe of people who are doing interpretations. It's very rich kind of quality, I think.
The dressing up thing we call boots and suits. But I mean, it's interesting because Mimi did her arrangement of In My Life in the original key in A, but you've done it up the octave. When I went to arrange it, and this was in the 80s, which was very, kind of close to John's death, I didn't think about doing it up the octave. It just felt dark, and I ended up doing it in D. And just placement, where you put the arrangement on the guitar, makes a big difference to how it speaks. Are you going to, my choice is, do I go to the original key? Do I find a place to put it on guitar that is guitaristically satisfying? Because that's a really important criteria for me.
Yeah, I mean, for guitarists, obviously, for solo guitar, it's a different world, and obviously A and D give us the opportunity of using open strings. It's their familiar tonalities. I also play Blackbird in the original key because it just feels right. And maybe somewhere in my musical memory, Tim, you were talking about how, the Beatles were really emblematic of the era that we were all living through, everything that we were, going through. And so somewhere it's sort of like in a musical memory, it's stored in there in a certain way. So I learned the original arrangement of Blackbird, but then when I went to do my own, I'll put in a little plug for Acoustic Guitar Magazine. I actually did a session on Blackbird, and you can find it online, and it was a lot of fun to play it and teach it. But anyway, there's something nice about the original keys, and there's something nice about exploring the different keys. It's all what we feel.
Yeah, I found that I couldn't work the melody into the Blackbird accompaniment because the accompaniment is so soft.
Where do you hear my weird ass version?
What I've done is I do it in Dagad in the key of A, and then it all works out that way.
Nice. I do it in drop D.
And going to Mimi's comment about having the open strings, I mean, that's one of the advantages of using an altered tuning of some kind, whether it's a drop D or a Dagad or whatever, is that it does give you more flexibility in the bottom end. And, because Paul's bass lines can be so important in the texture of this stuff. I mean, it's like I saw her standing there in Dagad in D, because that way I can get, when I go to the 5 chord, I have the open string. If you stick with the original key, you don't have that flexibility.
I wanted to maybe circle back a little bit to something that Laurence said a little while ago about sort of the all the layers in these songs. 'Cause, I mean, they not only have the really strong melodies, they not only have these genius chord progressions, but especially after the very early years, I mean, they have so many counter melodies, instrumental interludes on other instruments. They have even like the bass lines are so melodic often. So I'm wondering, when you set out to do a song like that on one guitar, you got 2 hands, how do you go about sort of, making an impression of all of that, all those different parts, which a lot of times they all seem so integral to the songs.
Well, I'll jump in there. I'll show a song I got. So there's a kind of just taking the melody of the song and coloring it in with some interesting jazz chords that are different from the original and give a different insight into the tune, a different feel. I particularly like the way this song in the melody has this that E7 sharp 9 that's in the melody. So there's an example.
That's cool. That makes me think of this arrangement that I did of Day Tripper on the baritone guitar. So I'm gonna pull out my baritone for a sec. I've got the I try to take these pieces and then think of, because they were so perfect as they were written, and we were, Jeffrey, you were talking about the layers, all of the different things. So I try to imply the layers through a jazz lens sometimes and come up with different things. So for instance, and now I come in now. Right, so I've got that, but then when I come, so let's see. And so I'm trying to keep that infectious groove going. I picked a baritone, which then is much more similar to a bass, and then applying the melody in octaves, which is more of a jazz technique, and I think kicks it off. And then when I come to that second part, when it modulates to A, I go right into a jazz bass line, because for me, as a jazz musician, this bass line sort of sounds to me like could be like all blues. I mean, it's just such an infectious bass line. So anyway, so for me, it's just sort of all connected, and then I get the harmonics in there. And it's a very guitaristic kind of thing that you can do. So I like to use everything the guitar gives me to try to create that layering and imply it without having to have a whole band with me, which is kind of cool. And of course, having a strong rhythmic drive is very helpful for that. So anyway.
See, I do it in DAGAD in D. Because I like to keep the parts consistently going, whether it's 2 or sometimes 3 parts. But I love the counterpoint. And I think part of it for me is just the challenge of making the bass line and the melody work together.
If you had advice for someone making their own arrangement of a Beatles tune on solo guitar, what would you say is something you gotta make sure you nail this, or start with this, or what would you say?
I'd say, I'll jump in here. Often when people are trying to play guitar, they think of chords. They start, say you think C, well, you think of putting your finger on the root of the chord and making the chord. But a lot of the coolest stuff comes from starting from the melody and finding the chord going the other way, going down. And even if you don't know anything about theory, there's just exploring the different shapes and intuitively recognizing those can be helpful. I'd like to show you a little example. Recently, this is a Lenny Broi arrangement of Hard Day's Night, or a sample of it. Had this way of playing these shapes, this tritone kind of combination for a 7th chord. Like there's A, and then this is D7. So I took some of that and I did this arrangement of. So that's full of these chord shapes that instead of having a base of the chord that names the note, like here, instead of this is E7, but I'm making a voicing that has the seventh in the bass. There's one way to look at it.
Laurence, how about you? What would you say is something you have to, really pay attention to?
Well, you have to start with the melody, because without the tune, you don't have a tune. I mean, it's, the melody, even if you change the articulation of it, I think the melody is the place to start. And I just look to the melody, I look to the bass line, and then I try and find a place where the voice works. And it's not always easy with Beatles songs, because especially when you get into the middle period, for example, with Strawberry Fields, it's in the cracks. I mean, it's between A and B flat, because they slowed one version down and sped up the other one, and they met in the middle. And so when I went to arrange it, I just couldn't find a place that it would fit until I realized that in Dagad that the E flat major 7 chord, which of course you can't do in standard tuning in that voicing. And then everything fell into place. But there's the intro. There's that seventh, actually it's a ninth voicing over a D. I mean, it's a G9 over a D. And the timbre is nice. It's like a cello kind of sound. Exactly. That it puts it in, and that's really, I mean, that's pretty close to the original key. It's a little higher, but it brings back, it resonates in the same way as the record does, and that's not always necessary or appropriate. But in this particular case, it was the only way that I could find to arrange the song that was really true to my experience of the song. And it, and I tend to favor lower register stuff. I just like the voice of the guitar when it's, in that kind of... What I like about your arrangements in Dagad is they don't sound like Dagad. Well, thank you. And that's really because I'm applying my musical understanding to it, that I'm not just using Dagad as a drone tuning, but I'm just using it as another standard tuning and just finding where the notes are and not being bound by chord shapes. I create my own whatever I need to, and it's or look over at Pierre Bensusan and kind of oh, that's how he does that. Okay. Segovia said to make a successful solo guitar arrangement of a piece that came from another setting was it should sound better than the original it was based on.
That's tough to do. I mean, especially with these tunes,
But that's a challenge. Is how do you make the arrangement compelling for the audience?
I was going to say, to me, I try to put my own personal stamp on it, honor the beauty of the melody. I mean, one thing we haven't talked about, and it's probably the best compliment I can get from a reviewer, critic, is if someone will say that you play lyrically. And I think about the lyrics to the tunes, and I try to put that into what I am creating. So, for example, with She's Leaving Home, you know. So again, I'm trying to take the beauty of the melody and really be expressive with it, and almost as if I'm singing the lyrics. And thank God for everyone that I'm not actually singing the lyrics, because what I lack vocally, I try to make up for instrumentally. And so, but then there are times, like I was thinking about, and Jeffrey, this come back to what you were saying about the layering, because in this case, I'm playing the cello part on the guitar, that you know, and combining all of the parts and just trying to make it very musical, but honor the lyrics and the intent. Yeah, that's so. Sometimes the song just is what it is, and it doesn't need in this case, it's a little bit of reharmonization as I get going, and I have more of a classical kind of technique that I was using on it. But sometimes I try to really reharmonize something and still keep the lyrics in mind, so, like Blackbird, so that I will have. And then the last verse, etc. So I'm hearing the beauty of the melody, but I'm trying, you know, Paul sings it and plays it, and it's perfect as what it is. But for me as a composer and a player, I try to find, you know, obviously the harmony is very reharmonized, but the melody is always there. To me, the melody is sacred. So it's a whole different approach, because there is no way to take, you know, to take what Paul did is, like I said, it's a perfect picture. So I'm trying to create another picture using what he wrote as the jumping off point.
Yeah, by comparison, I mean, my arrangement of Blackbird is playing Dagad in the key of A. And my benchmark was actually not Paul's version of it. I used to play that with Kenny Rankin. And Kenny's voice, I mean, he sang like he had a French horn in his throat. So, and I think it's important, not just the lyric, but the tone of the melody, kind of how the melody sits on the guitar, and how vocal it can be on the guitar, because you can, the voice of the instrument is so important. But I also, I mean, Tim's point about simplicity, and you don't have to add a lot, you don't have to put a lot in the arrangement if, you can keep things simple. It's such a beautiful melody. I chose not to try and reproduce what the Beatles did, but just did my own approach to that one.
We're talking lots about the melody here, and obviously these songs have such strong melodies, but there's also a lot of songs where, because they were very into such big vocal arrangements, choral kind of arrangements, sometimes it's almost hard to tell what the melody is. I mean, and the impression of the original recording is like, it's multiple voices. And then, so I'm wondering, in cases like that, do you ever try to, I don't know, somehow suggest that quality of a bunch of voices in harmony on the guitar?
Yeah, I mean, I did that on the little snippet I played of She's Leaving Home. That is actually implying it. There are parts of it played out where the melody's on top, but it's also, it's also all there. If I'm coming up here, so there I've got a counterpoint going on that's implying different, the different voices, the actual vocal thing. And yeah.
I mean, you can do it like If I Needed Someone. I mean, just with block harmonies too. Where it gets tricky is when you've got counterpoint going on with this harmony counterpoint, but you've also got the melody as a separate thing.
One thing about the arrangement now, there are tunes that have such a signature riff built into them, like Day Tripper, right? I mean, you can't do a solo version of that tune without putting that bass line into it, But a lot of songs, less is more they can also work, because like Laurence said, if you have the melody and you really phrase that, you don't have to have a really busy arrangement to have something that really works for the listener. I recently did an arrangement of for a show of Paul McCartney tune. I based it on Sergio Mendes' Brazil 66 arrangement.
That's the end of part 1. Tune in to part 2 to learn more about this arrangement, our guests' varied approaches to rhythm and groove, and much more. The Acoustic Guitar Podcast is brought to you by the team at Acoustic Guitar Magazine. I'm your host, Nick Grizzle, joined for this episode by Jeffrey Pepper Rodgers. The Acoustic Guitar Podcast is directed and edited by Joey Lusterman. Tanya Gonzalez is our producer. Executive producers are Lyzy Lusterman and Stephanie Campos del Broi. Intro music for this episode performed by Laurence Juber. If you enjoy this podcast and want to support us, please visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/acousticguitarplus or find the link in the show notes for this episode. As a supporter, you'll have access to exclusive bonus episodes along with other special perks. And if you're already a patron, thank you so much for your support.